There's a figure from history who's been much overlooked by philosophy departments. That person is Jesus. Cupitt participated in the Jesus Seminar at the University of California, Berkeley, a group which re-examined Jesus' actual sayings. Now he's written Jesus and Philosophy, in which he argues that the New Testament gives a misleading view of Jesus' philosophy. The real Jesus, according to Cupitt, was a great moralist and a radical humanist, who believed morality came not from a set of rules set down by God, but from humans themselves.
Don Cupitt, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're going to be talking about Jesus as a philosopher. Now, why should we even think of Jesus as a philosopher?
Because he's perhaps the most influential moralist who ever lived, but because he so quickly acquired supernatural status and was deified, he's never been taken seriously as a thinker. His teaching became corrupted by a huge amount of additional material included within the tradition, and it's not been possible to see him clearly until modern critical scholarship gave us better reconstructions of his teaching.
Basically, what you argue in your book is that many of the views attributed to Jesus are actually their accretions on the original work that he produced or were written down by other people on his behalf.
Yes, that's right, and must be true from the wide differences among the Gospels themselves. They differ greatly from each other, and if you add in the apocryphal Gospels as well, of which we have over 20, you see how freely people altered the tradition. When the Jesus Seminar in California 10, 15 years ago, set out to study the whole Jesus tradition, they listed 1,300 sayings of Jesus and passages about him that they wanted to scrutinize, and they decided to classify them under 4 heads. The best traditions are red, the next best pink, the next best grey, and the useless ones black. Out of the 1,300, only 29 were red. A slightly larger number, I think about 70, were pink. So it's those 100 or so sayings that give you something like a core of the best quality tradition. Furthermore, Jesus' sayings have a better chance of being original than his life. About his life we don't know much except that he was crucified. He was a wandering Jewish teacher, travelled around Palestine in the first third of the 1st century for a few years. Then he fell foul of the temple authorities in Jerusalem and he got crucified. But otherwise, he's really known for the first 20 years or so after his death, simply as a moral teacher. And then the supernatural beliefs about him began to develop. People began to believe that he was risen from the dead, that he had been the Christ or the Messiah designate, that he was exalted to heaven, and so on. And those beliefs developed very rapidly, and they soon hid his moral teaching. I'm thinking that the moral teaching remains very interesting and original and deserves a look.
You're saying that Jesus' writings, as commonly taken from the Gospels, don't fully represent what his moral views were.
Well, I'm saying that the Gospels were written after his death to spread the new faith that had grown up around him, and they treat the original Jesus very freely indeed. When the Jesus Seminar looked at them, they found that the most highly commended sayings were things like, love your enemy, go the second mile, if your coat is demanded, give your cloak as well. Sayings of Jesus in which he demands a kind of excessive generosity and non-violence. Those, I think, ordinary people and the scholars might agree on as the most nearly authentic we have of Jesus' teachings. But the doctrinal stuff and the stuff that's preoccupied with his own status that's attributed to him in the Gospels that's secondary. The original Jesus, oddly enough, never endorses the law of Moses, can't really be described as an Orthodox Jew, but can't really be described as teaching any Christian doctrine at all anyway. He's more like an Eastern sage.
The obvious message that modern Christians take from what they believe to be Jesus' teaching is salvation, the sense that what we do on earth could lead to a happy afterlife.
Yes, that's right. But Jesus doesn't in fact have any teaching in particular about sin and redemption. What particularly concerns him is human relationships. He wants to know why we're so often envious, suspicious, hostile, jealous in our relationships with each other. Why can't people get on together better? He wants to change human relationships, and for that he internalizes morality and teaches us to live from the heart. He wants to break with law morality, which balances rights and duties, and have instead a morality that flows direct from the human heart. That means he's implicitly a radical humanist. He's much more modern than at first appears. For example, he says, don't bother about traditional ideas of ritual pollution, because what goes into you from outside doesn't defile you. You're only defiled by what comes out of your own heart. He very strongly internalizes morality. Jesus was the first modern radical humanist.
It's interesting, there's Jesus the moralist, so he's got a particular message telling us how to live.
Yep.
That message seems to be something like, turn the other cheek.
Yes, that's right. In a book called The Meaning of the West, I copied out the 20-odd passages in the Old Testament where the ancient Jews dreamed about a better world in the future, the kingdom of God on earth. In all those passages is a secular, good society that they're asking for. The sort of good society that Karl Marx and liberalism were still asking for all those centuries later. So it's a basically secular, ethical dream of a society in which human beings really do get on better with each other. And he sees the way to it as getting rid of living under an external law and instead learning to live from the heart. Jesus takes from the Jewish prophets the idea that God himself recognizes that the Torah hasn't worked, it hasn't made people righteous. Instead, God's Spirit will have to be put into people's hearts, or the law will have to be internalized. People will have to have the confidence to trust their own hearts, their own feelings, the flow of feeling from themselves towards other people, and live by that.
But there's a very radical element to this as well. It's not just saying live by your own subjective interpretation of how we ought to be. The radical bit seems to be to go beyond conventional expectations of generosity to one's enemies, for instance.
Oh yes, the sort of excessive generosity that was sometimes practiced by Gandhi in using non-violent means to oppose a violent state. Gandhi, Martin Luther King, more recently Nelson Mandela, before the perhaps Tolstoy. Jesus wants to break with morality to conflict and violence and instead try a morality of love and see if human hearts can't be changed.
Yet Jesus presumably recognises that there's a strong drive in human psychology to punish the people who hurt us.
Oh yes, there is, yes. He recognises it's difficult. We're also very envious indeed and very upset by other people's good fortune. Jesus himself imagines that you might need an entirely new world for people to change. Jesus wants people to become more magnanimous, and that's not easy.
Well, one element of that is the famous idea of don't start removing the mote from somebody else's eye when you've got a plank in yours. In one sense, that's bad philosophy, isn't it? What's so great about reflecting one's own shortcomings when you can see that a wrong is being done elsewhere?
Yes, that saying shows Jesus as a pioneer of critical thinking in morality. Instead of judging other people, start by questioning your own credentials, as it were. Yes, as Socrates taught us to attend to language and the words we use, Jesus tries to extend critical thinking to morality as well, to make us ethically more self-aware. That's why he ridicules people like the Pharisees in their fine clothes and their religious self-importance, because they lack self-awareness.
Well, you could say that, look, I might be aware of how far I fall short of my moral ideals, but I can still recognise there's something wrong with somebody else stealing something from a shop in front of me.
Yes, there's no doubt about that, though Jesus still says, judge not that ye be not judged. We're so keen to denounce and pronounce upon other people, and he's the first people to introduce the idea of learning to be non-judgmental. Let me give an example of it. A few years ago, Mara Hindley was treated in Addenbrooke's hospital. There was protest in the local press about it, but it's essential to our idea of medicine that you treat baddies and goodies just the same. Clinical need is the only criterion, not race or sex or creed or moral virtue or anything else. Now, that notion of being non-judgmental was, I think, introduced by Jesus, and there are contexts in which we all need to remember that kind of thing.
But in other contexts, it would be very strange not to judge Myra Hindley because she was party to child murder and torture.
Of course, yes. Nevertheless, you do treat the wounded enemy soldier and you do treat the criminal as well.
Part of your approach to the Christian teaching is to say that it's a kind of meta-philosophy which humanises ethics when before it had always been a matter of divine law.
That's right, yes. Moralities of conscience and duty say that what matters in morality is your vertical relation to the moral law and to God. If you commit a sin against somebody, it's to God that you confess it, not to the neighbour. When I was young, all Western service books in Christianity had people confessing their sins every day to God, but not to the person you'd sinned against. And Jesus introduces a more horizontal morality of human relationships, breaking with the old vertical religious morality. That means that Jesus is religiously more subversive than at first appears. He marks the end of the old cosmic king idea of God. I remember some years ago, on Ascension Day, the Church Times newspaper saying in its editorial that the doctrine of the Ascension puts the lie to those who would wish to put man on the throne of the universe. But that's what Christianity does. Christianity does have a radically humanistic vision of the world. All things are yours, says St. Paul. It's a kind of vision of human sovereignty. The world is a human world. This means that Christianity is not the same as either Judaism or Islam, both of which have preferred to remain religions of divine law.
Yet it's true that in most subsequent versions, Christianity has remained largely a religion of divine law. So there are clear guidelines for how people should behave and indications where they've fallen short.
That's true, because Christianity was born into a world where absolute monarchy was the normal form of government, not least in the Roman Empire. And by the 4th century, Christianity was actually becoming official imperial ideology. And Christ was beginning to be seen as a royal figure with a crown on, and so on. But since the French Revolution and the rise of liberal democracy, sovereignty has become dispersed into the general public. The whole of Christianity is tending to become more Quakerish, with a God not centred but dispersed into people. Now, Jesus sees that coming. Not a single God up there and out there, but rather a dispersal of the divine into human hearts and into human relationships. By the way, I think there of Feuerbach. Feuerbach, 1840, about saying the same great year of religious humanism as the young Marx in the Communist Manifesto. The unity of I and thou is God, a line from Feuerbach. Feuerbach sees the divine in terms of human relationships. Well, that suggests that it's only in the modern period, with the rise of liberal democracy and modern secular humanism, that we've begun to see Jesus' teaching more clearly.
Now, just to get this straight, you're saying that the great tradition of Christian teaching is based on some fundamental errors about sources. And furthermore, Jesus wasn't teaching about heaven in the sense of a state that will be achieved in the future outside of this world. He was a secular teacher. And beyond that even, he was almost a proto-Nietzschean, questioning the idea that values could come from outside anyway.
Yes. Christianity got translated into a hierarchical, otherworldly faith, because that was the metaphysics of the world into which Christianity came. Beyond the human world, there was a higher, divine, eternal order where God reigned, and so on. So you had a hierarchical universe, a hierarchical human politics, and a hierarchical church. In the French Revolution, you began to get a movement towards romanticism, humanism, liberal democracy, and eventually postmodernism, in which there is nothing but the human conversation. So Jesus wants to demythologize everything into human relationships. He's looking forward to the kind of world we've got in postmodernity. So I actually see a certain return of Christ in postmodernity, a better understanding of what the man was all about all along. But it's taken a very long time to sink in.
Now, I can imagine some people listening to this saying, you're crazy. Look, Jesus had a very specific teaching about going to heaven and what's required for that. You're turning him into a secular postmodern humanist. That's absurd.
That's because this very elaborate metaphysical dress was imposed upon him earlier on, and people imagined Jesus making great claims for himself, claiming to be the Messiah, claiming to be God incarnate or something. I would say the historical Jesus was just not like that, quite obviously. And traces of the older view of Jesus are clearly present in the Gospels, when people call him a heretic and a blasphemer, and one who's in league with the devil. My two favourite bits of ambiguity in the Gospels that give away the truth are these. The first is the close resemblance between Jesus and Lucifer. Both are sons of God, both in their heavenly state are glorious and beautiful figures, both come down like lightning is the word, from heaven, both end up in the underworld. Both are sort of rebelling against the old God. There's extraordinary similarity. Both are the morning star. The ambiguity of the New Testament language about Jesus and Lucifer suggests a certain pulling apart of two figures who were originally identical, perhaps. The second ambiguity is this. Was Jesus a docile, obedient figure who always obeyed his Father's will, or was he a stroppy, rebellious type? On Christmas Eve, or Christmas Day, they get all soppy about the chorister in King's College Chapel, singing mild, obedient, good as he, and so on. You know, Jesus is a perfect child, but the only story about Jesus' childhood in the Gospels is one that shows him as being disobedient. And the original Jesus never appeared in church without causing trouble, as the Gospels say. In the Gospels, he's notoriously a dissenter, a dissident.
So, from what you're saying, Jesus was really primarily a philosopher. He wasn't primarily a religious teacher.
Well, we've separated too much the tradition of moral philosophy from the tradition of the great moralists, and I wanted to bring the two together a bit. I was slightly provoked in this by George Bush saying early in his presidency that Jesus was him a great philosopher, and I thought how ridiculous that is. But then that led me to the thought, but why have philosophers never asked about the status, the philosophical status of Jesus' teaching? I suggest in the book that even for somebody who's secular now, like me, I'm a secular Christian, not completely secular, I no longer go to church. For somebody like me, Jesus is so important that he almost is the hinge of history. It almost marks the difference between BC and AD, that a secular humanist morality, which is not supported by anything out there at all, became possible after Jesus. I think Jesus is a lost figure whom we're now beginning to recover and see a bit more clearly, and we see how much we owe to him.
Don Cupitt, thank you very much.
Thank you.